The House Committee on Constitutional Amendments has approved the measure implementing House Resolution Number 6, which calls for a constitutional convention to propose amendments to the 1987 Constitution.
Current and urgent problems that we are facing, escalating prices, low wages, massive hunger, joblessness, landlessness, do not stem from the 1987 Constitution. Yun po ang position namin. Hence, amending the Constitution will not magically cure these problems.
Aprobado na sa second reading ng Kamara ang resolusyong magpatawag ng Constitutional Convention o CONCON para maamyendahan ang 1987 Constitution.
Hindi ako sigurado na lulusot sa Senado yun eh. But siguro sa House lulusot yun. Alam mo, kontrolado nila yun eh. Pero alam mo, magandang labanan eh sa public debate.
We're closely watching developments in both houses of Congress as lawmakers move to amend the 1987 Constitution. But at the Senate, many are still on the fence when it comes to CHIEFS, mainly on its timing and how to do it. Over at the House of Representatives, the resolution for a constitutional convention has hurdled second reading. We speak with the lawmaker on top of the CHIEFS push in the lower chamber tonight on the CHIEFS. Ako po si Robbie Alapay. Kasama po natin dito sa Mandaluyong in studio. Aming Pamintuan, Editor-in-Chief po ng Philippine Stars, and Lucy Cruz Valdez. Bumiyahe pa from Quezon City.
Masanay-sanay ka na dyan, Robbie, ha?
Ay, nako talaga, biyahe na ngayon ang tawag eh, dahil sa traffic, di ba?
Pero kaya enjoy ako pagka Thursday eh. May pagkakataon tayo magsama-sama ulit sa studio.
Pero kulang tayo, wala
si Ed. Malayo kasi magagalingan nun eh.
Joke rin po yun.
Makati. Pero Ami, ano bang balita?
Eh, siyempre, binabantayan natin nag-aalala mga estudyante, mga magulang, sa nangyari na naman
yun.
sa Damson University, no?
Tsaka grabe yung ginawa ron ng pagpatago.
Oo.
Kung wala pang may nagsumbong, ano, eh hindi mo malalaman dahil inilibing na eh.
Yun naman.
Ay, hindi ba? Kung hindi pa nasumbong. At saka parang nakakapagtaka lang na walang kadala-dala talaga, no?
Wala talaga.
Despite that law, no? Dalawa na, pangalawa na actually.
And not just a law, let's be honest. Every generation, when we were in college, the ones after us, before our generation, parang every generation, we're all outraged by hazings, pero walang katigil-tigil.
Pero akala ko nga yung law magiging deterrent kahit pa paano eh, di ba? Kasi biro mo kahit nanonood ka lang, kasama ka eh sa mga arresto.
Kaya nga,
kasama
saka
sa mga
hindi ba,
kasuhan.
meron dong part of the law na dapat responsible, even the school.
Yes.
That's right.
Administrators, the parents, the owners of the house. Pero bakit nangyayari pa rin yan?
Saka ginagawa na nila sa labas nga ng school at hindi alam ng school, di ba?
And that's always the argument.
Mahirap eh.
At saka hindi parating argument naman on the other side na sinasabi, kasi meron din ng mga panawagan, hindi lang itigil ang hazing. Some calls go as far as iba ng mga fraternity. Yun naman ang panawagan ng kabilang side na kung iba natin fraternities, mag-underground lang yan. Mahihirapan tayo i-regulate.
Tsaka yung brotherhood mentality, malakas eh, di ba? Lalo na sa mga lalaki. I mean,
Siguro ang medyo kulang lang, no? Yung nakikita ng mga tao na may napaparusahan. Kasi in fact, ang nakikita natin, naghihimutok yung mga pamilya. Na bakit hindi lahat naparusahan? Bakit si ganito, si gano'n, nakawala?
yung Lenny
Diba?
Villa, akala natin
Yes.
yun ang magiging,
Exactly.
kumbaga,
Kasi
turning
tinago rin
point
yun,
somehow.
diba?
Yes, di ba? Hindi, tsaka ano yun mga may kaya.
Kaya ang nangyari,
yun, di ba?
ang nangyari, yung mga accused doon, actually, na-clear.
Na-clear din ang tagal, pero na-clear, di ba?
Naging abogado pa sila.
Correct.
Yan ang problema eh.
Yan ang nakakalungkot.
Yan. Kaya ganyan. Whatever, hindi ba? Basta crime. Pag hindi naparusahan, You
and-
breed impunity.
And also, it brings up basically the limitations of legislation also, because this takes a lot of things. Speaking of which, and that's my segue, we will be talking about...
Galing.
we will be
The
talking
very
about...
basic law.
Then, how much does it, I mean, how much does it really matter? Sa totoo lang, di ba?
Oo nga eh.
Even in the economic agenda that they want to open up, does it have to be charter change? Di ba? Anyway, we'll speak with our first guest. We'll take off from that and we begin our conversation with House Committee on Constitutional Amendments Chairman Rufus Rodriguez. The Chiefs will be right back.
Welcome back to the Chiefs. Let's talk about Cha-Cha and Con-Con with no less than the chairman of the House Committee on Constitutional Amendments, Congressman Rufus Rodriguez. He's joining us via Zoom from Cagayan de Oro. Good evening, Congressman Rufus.
Hello, Congressman.
Good evening, Luchi.
Magandang araw po,
Ami,
Congressman.
And Robbie, the Chiefs, maayong gabi. Good evening.
Good evening. Sir, okay, lahat nag-aabang sa move ninyo dahil, sir, medyo taliwas ito sa parang kagustuhan, no? The expressed, policy at least at the moment of no less than the President. Sabi niya hindi niya priority itong charter change and yet you have moved on with it. Even to the extent na finigure out nyo na con-con is the way to do it. Exactly where does the House Committee stand in regard to President Marcos's stand that this is not a priority?
Well, our committee has decided that we proceed with our constitutional convention. That is the result of our 4 hearings at the Batasang Pambansa and then 4 public consultations at the different places in the Philippines. Cagayan de Oro for Mindanao, Iloilo for Visayas, and then for Luzon, outside Metro Manila, is Bulacan and San Fernando, Pampanga. And so we have to be able to accept the mandate of our
Okay, medyo nagkakaroon po tayo ng technical trouble.
convention now.
All right.
Hello?
Apo.
Yeah.
Medyo nagiging
This
choppy
one, is
po.
it okay?
Nakikita naman ng mga viewers natin na si Congressman ay nasa kotse ngayon, kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng konti problema. But Congressman, I mean, you're back with us. If we could ask, bakit po convention? Bakit po constitutional convention ang gusto niyong format and methodology for this?
Former Chief Justice Justice Renato Puno and Justice Ado Tascuna, they are of the belief that a CONCON is more democratic, more inclusive. So therefore, it will not be, if we have constitutional assembly, it will be the congressmen and senators who will be deciding what will be the amendments. They will say, that will be self-serving because they sit now in Congress. So it's better to have duly elected and appointed representatives in a hybrid constitutional convention. Robbie, Luchi, and Ami.
Congressman, yung counterpart niyo sa Senate, si Senator Robin Hood Padilla, pumalag kagad dyan sa CONCON, sabi niya masyado daw magastos. And the figure mentioned in the House, yung 10,000 pesos per diem ng mga magiging delegates, maraming nagpo-protesta ngayon. Anong masasabi niyo? I understand you've passed parang supplemental measure for the budget. At sinabi ni Congressman Salo na 9.5 billion lang naman daw yun. It's just a drop in the bucket. Lalo yatang sumama reaction ng mga tao dun sa sinabi na yun. Anong masasabi niyo about the criticisms about the expenses?
Yes, Ami, precisely. The expense is always considered in undertaking a activity like a constitutional convention. However, we can again quote former Chief Justice Renato Puno, we will be spending less than 10 billion. And what he said is that, well, even if it's 10 billion or what, an expense for constitutional change to be able to uplift, for example, the economic situation of our country by amending economic provisions. This will be not an expense but an investment on our people and our economy.
Which
So
is
therefore,
the...
10 billion,
Yeah.
10 billion in a 5 trillion budget is really not meeting the purpose of this activity, which is constitutional change.
Yun po ang susunod na tanong ng lahat. Ano po ba ang lawak o extent nung mga pagbabagong gusto nyong sagawa, no? What is the extent of the change in the charter that you intend to do, that you're willing to go all out in calling for a con to be elected and so on and so forth? Hindi lang po ba economic provisions to?
Well, very clear in our public consultations, out of 560 reactors and public, our respondents and our participants in our public consultations, 77% say we should have a change now, and over 60% are for the mode of con, and more than 50% are for economic provisions. So therefore, clearly, because of those, the mandate of our people over these public consultations, our resolution calling for a constitutional convention states that amendments to economic provisions. So very clear that the mandate of our call is for the economic provisions. However, as you very well know, when we have a constitutional convention, there will be supreme constituent power of the duly elected delegates and appointed delegates. And so the answer is, it will be open also, aside from economic amendments, it will be open to political amendments. But we wish that our delegates stick to economic amendments.
Yes, sir. But alam naman po natin, once we open that can of worms, talagang pag-uusapan na lahat. I think that's a given. But doon po sa consultations nyo and the surveys, you mentioned that yung economic reform, economic changes is obviously very high. What are the other top-ranking things na lumalabas sa survey na yun? You talked about, for example, political reform will also be touched. Ano po yung mga lumabas sa mga consultation nyo na lalabas na specific suggestions na maaring magalaw sa political structure?
Based on our more than 500 respondents and reactors, more than 50% are for economic, only 15% for political amendments. So really, there is not much clamor for political change kasi magulo yan. So therefore, we hope that the convention will be able to tackle our economic amendments. Roby.
Apa, but let's clarify that po. When you say that there is no clamor for political change, that refers to civilians, citizens, different sectors that you consulted.
No, all the reactors.
Okay. Oh, but even but we're thinking
Roby,
of
Yes.
Roby, we consulted experts, we consulted the business sector, we consulted also not only in government, but more so with different sectors, the farmers group, the fisher folks. We went around the country and we made sure that we can hear from the different marginalized sectors. And that is why they are not so much for political reform. They are for economic amendments so that we can lift all these constitutional barriers to the coming in of foreign investments and therefore have job creation and more employment opportunities to our people. That is what our people need, our people mandates for us to do. So therefore, it's only on the economic amendments.
yes, but Congressman, if you don't mind, sorry, Ami, but ano bang guarantee ng public that all of those sectors that you mentioned are the voices that's going to be heard in a constitutional convention? Kasi, I mean, aminin na po natin, ang concern ko naman, pagka nag-eleksyon tayo sa mga distrito, sino magre-represent? Baka kaapelido yung lahat yung mga, baka kaapelido lahat ng congressman din ang mananalo doon.
Kaya, Roby, based on the suggestion of Chief Justice Puno, ang sitwasyon ngayon is that hindi na lahat ng mga delegates elected. of the 100% delegates, 80% are elected coming from 253 districts, and 20% or 54 will be appointed from the marginalized sectors and the experts.
Pero minority rin yun, sir, kung tutuusin.
Super majority
Oo,
pa rin
you
yun,
still have a super
80%.
majority.
Parang ganun din ang nangyari sa party list system sa totoo
I
lang.
guess to be more specific, wala po ba kayong set na limitations? Halimbawa, in terms of how extensive the changes should be, wala bang i-eliminate? Halimbawa, di ba pwedeng meron niyang hanggang dito lang, ito lang ang pwedeng palitan? Hindi na kailangan palitan, halimbawa, yung form of government. I mean, or terms, di ba? Yung mga, yan yung dyan napapraning mga tao, sir, eh.
Hindi makokontrol yun.
Oo. Paano ba?
Well, Luchi, when we have a constitutional convention, they will exercise supreme constituent powers. So when we suggest that it will be economic provisions, they may, as I've said, our Congress, the House of Representatives, has stated in our resolution that the amendment should be for economic provisions.
Pero Congressman, dahil you are pushing for economic provisions, yan na nga yung sinabi ni President Marcos, di ba? Marami na daw nagawa na pass na legislation, in fact, to liberalize our economy. Meron kang
Public
Service Act na a wide range of public utilities, 100% foreign ownership. You have a Retail Trade Liberalization Act. You have a Foreign Investment Act. Ano pang, pwede naman daw na gawin yon kahit walang charter change. So, ano naman po masasabi nyo doon? Si President Marcos ang nagsasalita dyan.
Well, you see, the amendments to the Public Service Act, which we approved in Congress, is now questioned in the Supreme Court. When we redefined and excluded telecommunications and transportation, two groups of associations have filed a case in the Supreme Court, precisely on the issue that it is unconstitutional, because public utilities always include telecommunications and transportation, and why does this law exclude them? And that is why, unless we change the Constitution, nobody will come here, especially because the law is now in the Supreme Court. So they will not invest based on our Public Service Act revision, because there are now two petitions in the Supreme Court. Also, recently decided by the Supreme Court is the Joint Marine Seismic Survey. The Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional, because we allow the Chinese to dig. So 100% Chinese doing that? No, according to the Supreme Court. Only Filipino, 60% Filipino and 40% foreign can explore our natural resources. Very clearly, what we have is not enough.
May isa
What we
pang
have will not invite investors.
Congressman,
Because even the President Marcos would go around and invite the investors all over the world to come here. Then the next question is, but they're only limited to 40%.
pero may isa pang sinasabi sila na if we want investors here, marami ring nirereklamo pa yung mga investors, yung ease of doing business, yung kulang sa infrastructure, yung weak regulatory environment, yung weak rule of law. So, kahit daw ganyan, at they're pointing to China, no, and Communist China and Vietnam na hindi pwede rin ng full foreign ownership. Bakit katakot-takot daw ang investor nila?
I think
Mukhang,
nawala.
Nawala
okay.
yata.
Pero that's a good point.
Hindi
no?
ba?
Totoo yan eh. Kahit naman gawin nilang 100%, pwede na sila mag-full ownership.
Kaya
Kung
nga.
mahirap pa rin magnegosyo. Di ba?
Kasi Ben nga, ease of doing business, every survey shows, yun naman ang unang lumalabas sa concern ng mga investors.
Hindi naman nila hinihingi,
Hindi lang
di ba
foreign,
na?
Hindi local.
Totoo yan. Oo.
Di ba? So, they complain about corruption. They
Yes.
complain about red tape.
Red tape.
Di ba?
Oh, hindi
All of-
mawala-wala.
Oh, di ba? Lahat ng kailangan ka magmano, lahat ng kailangan mong isubmit. Then they'll talk about taxes, they'll talk about incentives, but none of that needs a constitutional...
Meron ka ng tax incentive. Alam mo, pati itlog ngayon, sinisisi nila yung pagtaas dahil from barangay to every checkpoint all the
Lahat
way,
may tax.
transporting
All the way.
from the farm
May
to the
VAT.
retail. Merong bayad.
Oo, totoo yan.
Inspection fee. So kapag ganyan ang pagninegosyo, I don't
wala
think it has
talagang
anything to do
magnenegosyo,
with
lalo na pag
charter
foreign.
change.
Hindi, tsaka yung isang point dyan, yung point din ni Senator Robin Hood, no? Ang point nga niya is economic provisions lang, ba't magko-con-con pa? Di ba? Parang pwede namang Constituent Assembly, constitutional din naman yun, di ba? Yun, hindi yun tatanungin, di ba? Hindi na pwedeng questionin yun. Ang tanong mo dyan yung con-con, di ba? Mag-elections ka, di ba? Tapos given the time frame, kasi isasabay pa nila sa October barangay elections.
Gulo-gulo na nun, ano?
Di ba, parang do we have enough time also to choose the kind, if even we choose. So, ang mangyayari nga talaga, mga dynastic families na naman yan.
Hindi naman nila pwedeng pagbawalan yung mga kamag-anak nila.
Correct, di ba?
Na tumakbo.
Oo.
Di ba?
Yun nga eh.
Because, remember, among other things that the Constitution calls for is for Congress to pass an anti-dynasty law.
Oo,
diba? Na ayaw nilang aksyonan.
Remember, nagkaroon nga ng ganyang draft charter. Ibinigay sa House, hindi yata. Ayan na.
Ayan na. Ay, si Congressman, sorry. Hindi namin. Baka nahuli na. Pinag-uusapan po kayo ni Amit tsaka ni Luchi dito eh.
Nangunguna po si Robbie.
Congressman, narinig niyo po ba yung question ko? Do I have to repeat it?
Nakamute po, nakamute.
Sir, nakamute po kayo.
Nakamute po kayo?
Ayan.
Do I have to repeat the question?
No need. I did not the question. I was saying that the revision of the public service law, which became law, is now under question in the Supreme Court. Two organizations question it because they are saying it is unconstitutional. Because telecommunications and transportation, which were excluded from the Public Service Act in its definition, is against the Constitution because the Constitution says any franchise for a public utility. And all our decisions of the Supreme Court, public utilities involve transportation, telecommunications, water, electricity. And that is why I question now, who will be the investment will come?
Pero ang
Nawala
tanong
siya
po
ulit.
ni...
Pero
the
ang,
public service question in the Supreme Court.
pero ang sabi ko nga, Congressman, hindi lang naman yan ang reklamo actually ng mga investors eh. Marami na silang in-issue statement, ang nirereklamo nila, red tape, ease of doing business, corruption, yung weak rule of law, weak regulatory environment. Yan ang mga reklamo nila actually eh. Hindi naman and I mentioned na bakit ang Communist China and Vietnam, they don't allow full foreign ownership of whatever. Pero bakit ganun katakot-takot parang investor nila? I mean, I'm just saying what the investors are saying.
Well, I have the position paper of the Joint Chamber of Commerce, American, the Foreign Chamber of Commerce. They are for constitutional change. They are saying that their countries and their businessmen will come here if there is a lifting of these restrictions. Then we have the PCCI with Mr. President George Barcelon in favor because they want investments to come here. Also the Management Association of the Philippines, Attorney Peripe. So the businessmen are saying that yes, we need this constitutional change now. Because if we don't have it, there will be hesitancy because the Public Service Act is under question in the Supreme Court and the Joint Seismic Marine Survey has been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So that is what it is. And that's why our committee has already decided overwhelmingly to continue with this because we are the most restrictive countries among the ASEAN. The Philippines is the most restrictive in terms of foreign investments influx. In the world, we are the third most restrictive. That is OECD report. And the World Bank states that the prescription of the World Bank for development of countries is to be able to reduce restrictiveness of investments coming in. So based on those studies, it is clear that economic amendments will be an impetus for economic development for our country.
All right. Maraming salamat po sa inyo, Chairman of the House Committee on Constitutional Amendments, Congressman Rufus Rodriguez. And we are starting up another conversation right after this breather. Keep it here on One News.
Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has met President Bongbong Marcos in Malacanang. The two leaders will discuss several political and security issues as well as economic cooperation.
The Philippines and Malaysia have agreed to take a different approach on the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. This after President Bongbong Marcos meeting with Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who will be leaving today after his overnight visit to the Philippines.
We did discuss the South China Sea issue, and I shared President Marcos Jr.'s concern that due to the complexity and sensitivity of the issue, we should try and engage and take the position at the multilateral level between ASEAN so that we have a comprehensive approach and achieve an amicable resolution to this outstanding problem.
Prime Minister Dato Seri Anwar Ibrahim and I had a cordial and productive discussion on Philippines-Malaysia bilateral cooperation, reaffirming our two countries' desire to revitalize relations as we traverse past the pandemic, then through the years that towards a new normal.
Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's two-day visit to the Philippines ends today. What's the significance of this brief visit to Manila and Kuala Lumpur? Weighing in is geopolitical analyst Richard Haydarian. Good evening, Professor Haydarian, and welcome back to the Chiefs.
As always, it's a pleasure to join you folks.
Good evening, Richard.
Good evening.
Good evening, at balita ko birthday mo bukas, so we will greet you na.
Happy birthday.
Be kind.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Ilang taong ka? No, joke.
Richard, it's significant, no, that the first official visit to be hosted by President Marcos is the Prime Minister of Malaysia. What can we explore? Balita ko, we will be exploring stronger defense ties with Malaysia. What exactly can we achieve by strengthening our relations with this administration of Anwar?
Right. First of all, pag-usapan natin si Anwar Ibrahim, no? He's a very interesting character. Kung maalala niyo, he has been very passionately following politics in the Philippines, I think more than any other Southeast Asian leader. As far as I know, he has written a lot about the legacy of the Aquinos in the Philippines. He has been a great admirer of the Philippines People Power Revolution for quite some time. And he cited Aquinos, from Ninoy all the way to Benigno Aquino, as an inspiration for himself when he was running for the Prime Minister. But of course, now he's the Prime Minister, and he's coming to the Philippines where you have Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as the president, right? So I was really curious about how this is going to go. But of course, he is a seasoned statesman. He knows how to deal with other politicians. He knows how to deal with a situation like this. I heard that even President Marcos Jr. at some point said na parang pati siya, it took him a very long time to make it, back to the Malacanang, in the same way that, it took a very long, effort also for Prime Minister Anwar to make it there to the office. But obviously, we know the circumstances are kind of different. So I found those reports quite ironic. But nonetheless, we know that when it comes to Malaysia, very complicated ang relationship natin with Malaysia, no? So I did a book back in the day, book chapter on WikiLeaks, for instance, yung mga leaked cables ng mga American embassy, etc. And it was showing that back in the 1970s, the Malaysians were begging the British to beg the Americans to ask the Marcos administration back then, for instance, not to invade them. So clearly, 50 years ago, there was a very real threat, as far as the Malaysians were concerned, of potential military confrontation with the Philippines. And they were worried whether they could hold it together, right? And obviously, we know that there were a lot of reports suggesting that Malaysia had an interest in the conflict in Mindanao because that bogged us down and prevented us from moving decisively on the Sabah issue. But in the more recent years, alam natin when it comes to our relations with Malaysia, yung isang malaking aspeto dyan, yung OFWs, we have a lot of overseas Filipino workers there. We have a lot of Filipino citizens who easily pass the porous borders between, Malaysia and the Philippines, and that also creates a lot of complications, but also a lot of opportunities. Pero alam din natin, in fairness to Malaysia, especially under former Prime Minister Najib and former President Aquino, there was a lot of coordination on dealing with the problem in Mindanao. And we knew that dealing with the problem in Mindanao, the peace process in Mindanao, the Bangsamoro issue could not be fully resolved if we didn't have the buy-in of Malaysia. So the direction of bilateral relations has been going well despite the hiccup that happened, of course, nung sumugod yung mga supporters ng dating Sulu Sultanate dun sa Sabah ng Malaysia back in the day. But I think overall there's an understanding that we don't want to provoke Malaysia on the Sabah issue as much as perhaps some people in the Philippines want. At the same time, on the issue of OFWs, we want to have some understanding there to make sure that we protect our interests there. But more importantly, after Marawi, tumaas na po yung cooperation between our militaries and law enforcement agencies when it comes to doon sa issue ng counterterrorism and piracy, especially because of what happened in Marawi. And now, obviously, we're also talking about West Philippine Sea and South China Sea because Malaysia din may claim din sa West Philippine Sea and South China Sea. And interestingly, Malaysia learned lessons from our arbitration award. So if you look at it, back in, I think, 2019, if I'm not mistaken, December 2019, Malaysia filed an extended continental shelf claim to the United Nations to also protect its sovereign rights dyan sa South China Sea and West Philippine Sea. So Malaysia also got a lot of inspiration from the Philippines standing up to China, not under President Duterte, but under President Aquino. And now under President Marcos Jr., we see once again we're standing up to China. So I'm sure Anwar Ibrahim is taking note of that, and perhaps there's going to be more coordination in the West Philippine Sea issue.
Sige, let's seize on that. Ang dami nating linatag doon, no? But let's seize on that to explicitly say we want to talk about the South China Sea right now. Not just the Philippines and Malaysia, but what influence might this have on an ASEAN strategy on how to deal with China? It's not just Malaysia and the Philippines that have claims over those disputed areas as well. Vietnam, for example, is also a major stakeholder. Indonesia as well. What might this do for the stakeholders there and for the larger ASEAN?
Right. Of course, Malaysia, excellent question. Malaysia and the Philippines are founding members of ASEAN. So we have to have some sort of diplomatic cachet. Now, the thing on the South China Sea is that actually, interestingly, Malaysia and Vietnam also have overlapping claims, no? Dun sa western parts of the South China Sea. And more recently, they have moved towards maritime delimitation. Now, bakit mahalaga ito? Because a lot of us have been arguing, including Justice Cartry, including friends in Australia like Carlisle Thayer, that why not, instead na pipilitin natin yung code of conduct sa pagitan ng ASEAN and China, which has been going nowhere because meron kang Laos, meron kang Cambodia, meron kang maraming bansa dyan sa ASEAN na ayaw nila makialam sa issue ng South China Sea because mas mahalaga sa akin nila yung economic relationship nila with China or their geopolitical relations with China, no? So ayaw nila makisaw-saw doon. So the best thing for us is actually to push for a code of conduct among us claimant states, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and to a certain degree, Brunei, although Brunei is not an active claimant state in the South China Sea. So if we do that, then I think we're in a better position of dealing with China. And mahalaga, any code of conduct or any maritime delimitation or any kind of agreement we do in the West Philippines and the South China Sea with Malaysia, with Vietnam, Philippines, trilateral, it has to be in consonance with international law and particularly dun sa arbitration award natin noong 2015, which by the way, neither Malaysia nor Vietnam have openly contradicted. In fact, Malaysia, 2-3 years ago, invoked the Philippine Arbitration Award to threaten China of a potential parallel or similar arbitration case against them. So in short, meron tayong basic agreements on UNCLOS, meron tayong fundamental understanding on the arbitration award of the Philippines in 2015. Why not let's do a code of conduct among ourselves, or at least let's push ASEAN to do something about yung deadlock sa code of conduct negotiations, because dinidribble lang naman talaga tayo ng China eh. I mean, sino bang niloloko natin dito, no? Ilang years na? 1998, 1999 pa lang pinag-usapan natin yung legal binding code of conduct. Wala pa ako sa high school noon, di ba? And now, here we are, di ba? Birthday na natin, we're entering a new phase, and still the code of conduct is not going anywhere. So I think Malaysia and Philippines could be a core element of a much more decisive regional response to the issue as far as the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, and China's assertiveness in the area is concerned.
Actually, even more basic pa nga than the West Philippine Sea dispute and how we have shared interests in that, no? Right. It's the question of exactly how big a player Malaysia is in ASEAN. And what does the Philippines really stand to gain by stronger diplomatic relations with them, either economically or, well, apart from the war, no? Especially in the context of our Sabah claim. Are we just going to keep it quiet and keep the status quo and never run after that ever again? Or So, in other words, can you describe to us what exactly our relationship with Malaysia is and Malaysia's role in the ASEAN, where we also play some role? Equal footing ba talaga tayo dyan, or sino bang mas significant?
Right. Yeah. Well, thankfully, because of our rapid economic growth, our GDP is almost the same size as Malaysia, and we're expected to have a bigger economy than Malaysia in the coming years. Something that is quite new. No, I mean, for a long time, Malaysia, Singapore, these were the big economies, along with Indonesia and Thailand. Philippines, medyo pichugin sa region. But now I think we're moving forward. We're leaping ahead, and so I think hopefully they'll take us more seriously. More than that, the Philippines is also taking ASEAN more seriously. We saw Bongbong Marcos talking a lot about ASEAN solidarity, Philippine leadership within ASEAN, which, by the way, very much harkens back to his dad. Now, nonetheless, when it comes to Malaysia, as I said, we have a complicated relationship with them. And if you talk about Malaysia, let's not forget, for a very long time, Malaysia was on the shadow of one man, right? And that man is Mahathir. Mahathir, who was actually in Manila, and I interviewed him, of course, for a different channel back then, when he visited the Philippines back in 2019. No? So Mahathir's shadow is still there. He ran in these latest elections, by the way. No? Hindi siya nanalo. But Mahathir has been there. So the challenge right now is not only what is going to be Malaysia's position, but what is going to be a non-Mahathir prime minister's position, because almost all other prime ministers were proteges. And in the case, by the way, of Anwar Ibrahim, he used to be the deputy prime minister of Mahathir. So what we're waiting here is, will Anwar come up with a new image, understanding, and vision of Malaysia that is different from Mahathir? Because Mahathir dominated. Mahathir is a very domineering character, for better or for worse. He really, if he's there, you really feel his presence. So when he was in charge of Malaysia, he was the elder statesman. He was the de facto top leader of ASEAN. But now that you have no longer Mahathir in the picture, the question is, can Anwar Ibrahim also step up to the plate? So that's why we cannot answer your question directly, Lucio, because Malaysia itself still has to find its footing in a post-Mahathir era. I mean, of course, Mahathir wants to stick around, but he's, I think, already 99 years old. No, so that's the other issue that Malaysia is facing. Nonetheless, as far as Malaysia is concerned, I think they're realizing that if ASEAN doesn't hold it together, it's bad for all of us. Because on our own, even if Malaysia is a relatively middle-sized economy, even if the Philippines is a relatively middle-power country, we cannot deal with the major powers on our own. We have to stick it together. And let me tell you, Malaysia is actually an interesting country because on the surface, Malaysia is kind of non-aligned. In fact, much closer to China than US, that's the understanding. But we know behind the scenes, the Malaysian military has been expanding defense cooperation with the US Navy and other partners because they're also worried about China. Ang kulang lang sa Malaysia is a little bit more confidence, a little bit more nudge, a little bit more support from Indonesia, Singapore, and Philippines for them to be more assertive towards China. So ironically, although Malaysia is seen as a much more developed, prosperous, big brother within ASEAN, on China, they have been relatively timid throughout the years, with some exceptions here and there when Mahathir came back in 2018, 2019. So let's see where Anwar Mahathir is moving forward. And as I said, because Anwar Ibrahim has this special relationship, special intellectual, moral, even emotional relationship with the Philippines, and I know this is beyond just the Aquinos, it's really about fascination he has about the Philippines, I think that could really lay down the foundation for a new era of bilateral relationship with Malaysia.
Yeah.
And Richard,
we can have a dyad or a triad together with Indonesia or a quad with Singapore to really get things going. Yeah.
Now, the reason I also ask is I recall that you yourself observed that President Marcos seems to be playing a major role in ASEAN, acting like, the diplomat for all, representing even ASEAN, although he's not really openly declaring it. So I'm wondering now whether you think that this is, in fact, a good opportunity for him to play that role in a bigger sense now that it's Prime Minister Ibrahim that's there.
Right. Fascinating. Great question. I mean, I was just talking to Ambassador Romualdez the other day. I mean, this is on the record already. I mean, because I raised something that I argued back in the day, back in June last year pa. Sabi ko, the thing with Marcos Jr. is that he's going to be more like his father than Tatay Digong, right? So, and Ambassador Romualdez more or less confirmed that based on their conversations now, Marcos Jr. always kind of goes back to anong ginawa ng father ko and how that can guide me also in dealing with the difficult situation we're facing. Of course, his father was dealing with this US, Soviet Union, China, very difficult situation. Today, we have this Russia, China, West kind of situation. So clearly, Marcos Jr. is trying to revive yung Philippine leadership na meron tayo nung panahon ni Marcos Sr. Now, we can debate about the human rights issues, or actually not debate, the facts are true. We can talk about the economic failures under Marcos Sr. We can talk about all of that. But I will tell you this, not because I'm in Baguio right now or Solid North, no. In fairness to Marcos Sr., I'll give him credit when it comes to foreign policy and asserting Philippine position, not only in ASEAN, but in the post-colonial world, Afro-Asiatic world, relations with Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East. He was perhaps our most proactive president in memory. And in as much as Anwar Ibrahim operates under the shadow of Mahathir Mohamad, Marcos Jr. also operates under shadow of his own father.
Yes, but to that
and
point,
I think that is why he has this aspiration to be a bigger leader in the region. But that's going to be difficult right now, Raul, because we're now getting closer to the US, Japan, and Australia. So maybe this will create some frictions because some of the ASEAN countries are going to say, oh, here it goes again, the Philippines. They're going to be the deputy sheriff of the United States in ASEAN.
Yes,
so
but Richard, pasensya na, before we run out of time, before we get back again to the geopolitics, we talked about the implications for China, we talked about implications for ASEAN. I want to round back, since we're talking about President Marcos, I want to round back to your first point, diba? How interesting it is that Anwar Ibrahim is the first head of state to visit him here, to stand side by side with President Marcos Jr. in Malacanang. And, the reality is, we're just coming out of a celebration of EDSA People Power. President Marcos had to walk a tightrope there and strike a balancing act there. And then Ibrahim himself and Anwar himself, as you pointed out, has been the constant democratic symbol for the democratic movement in Malaysia. And had it been any other ASEAN leader, a junta leader in Myanmar, or anybody from the PAP in Singapore, or anybody from Thailand, there would be no irony and nothing noteworthy in this juxtaposition of where Anwar's image is coming from as a democratic icon, and now President Marcos, who is trying to rehabilitate the name of his father. I mean, talk a bit more about that, what this means, not just for his presidency, but for him personally, President Marcos personally, who really has been targeting the foreign audience as well as his primary audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Anwar Ibrahim is also considered as one of the most influential Muslim leaders in the world. And, he has been very influential in shaping discourse in major capitals of the world when it comes to Islam, democracy, relationship between the Islamic Muslim majority countries and the West, etc. So he is a public intellectual. He's a global intellectual. So Anwar Ibrahim is no ordinary prime minister. And that's why I'm confident he's going to step up the plate, even though he's still under the shadow of Mahathir in one way or another. Now, going back to this, my sense is both are kind of moving to kind of a center, if I can put it this way. On one hand, we see Marcos Jr. has been really extending this reconciliation this gesture of reconciliation, extending the olive branch. We saw the message he had, much more conciliatory than perhaps what we saw from Amy Marcos, something that we discussed also, this potential siblings rivalry, etc. And then at the same time, if we look at Anwar Ibrahim, look at his cabinet, right? Look at the statements he has made, for instance, on LGBTQ rights. Clearly, this is not the Anwar Ibrahim liberal Democrat that we used to know. Why? Not because he's trapo, no, because he has to deal with the reality of Malaysian politics, which is far more conservative. And by the way, his prime minister position was not a foregone conclusion. The Islamist PAS party did really, really well in the previous election. So in short, he is a statesman. politiko din siya. So yes, there's an irony there, but I think Anwar Ibrahim wants to build a good relationship with Marcos Jr. because I think he also understands Marcos Jr. also wants to fully rehabilitate his family's name internationally, not only in the Philippines, but obviously, counterfactually, I think if Eleni Robredo or an Aquino were the president, I think the bilateral relationship would have been far more spirited, energetic, and exciting with an Anwar administration, precisely because of that ideological, moral, ethical, and personal sentimental backgrounds that I talk about. But then again, both men are statesmen and they're moving to the center, and I think they can work it out from there. But again, I want to see more before I can make a statement on how good the chemistry between these two leaders were. At least they both showed they're great statesmen.
So Richard, going back to China, how different can Anwar be when it comes to dealing with China? Because you heard him say that we have to take the multilateral approach. ASEAN has to take the multilateral approach, which is exactly what China wants. No, China wants bilateral. You think that's a sustained direction that Malaysia can take in dealing with China?
Yeah, again, I think all kudos to Prime Minister Mahathir. Prime Minister Mahathir was someone who could speak, from both sides. I mean, he would say nice things to China and then go to Japan and say different things. Yes, but in fairness to Mahathir, when he was back in power in 2018-19, he really took a different tone towards China. No, he really went after China on bad investments, on so-called debt trap diplomacy. Of course, he toned it down later on, but that was the time when he already made his positions very clear. And globally, Mahathir inspired leaders from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka and others to also question China's, debt trap diplomacy or so-called debt trap diplomacy. On South China Sea, diba, sabi ni Mahathir noon, diba, it's very important we have demilitarization, which also applies to China, not only to the United States, but he also pushed for an extended continental shelf claim, which directly questioned China's claims in much parts of the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea, among others. And more than that, Malaysia also was much more proactive on dealing with other ASEAN issues, for instance, the Rohingya issue, etc. So my sense is Mahathir kind of changed Malaysia's policy's direction in ways that actually contradicted his own earlier position. Because back in the 1990s, Mahathir was the one who bashed the West and was friendly towards China. Very Duterte, right? But Mahathir was completely different by the mid-2000s, 2010s, sorry. And when he came back, he really went after China. So even if he recalibrated, I don't think Malaysia can go back to that, very overly friendly, even obsequious position that it had towards China. I don't think that's doable. And even public opinion is shifting in Malaysia. We see more and more negative opinion towards China, not only because of West Philippine Sea, but also because of what happens in Xinjiang, against the Uyghur Muslim minority. So it is true that Malaysian officials tend to be far more subtle, if not friendly towards China, in spite of the disputes in the South China Sea. But if you look at the actions on the ground, not to mention Malaysia building defense cooperation with the US quietly and other partners, that shows that actually there's much more common ground between us and Malaysia than we recognize. But then again, let's see how Marcos Jr. works it out with Anwar Ibrahim. And who knows? Maybe both of them want to open a new chapter, not only in their own political lives, but also in our bilateral relationship. So it's going to be one of those fascinating bilateral relationships that I'm going to watch out for in the coming years. And so as much as I've been watching Anwar Ibrahim's political career, very fascinating political career over the past 2 decades or so.
What about for Malaysia? What's in it for Malaysia as far as Philippines is concerned? What can we give Malaysia at this point, apart from, helping to consider a new approach to resolve the Myanmar crisis? Is there anything here that's beneficial for Malaysia?
Yeah, definitely. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim talked about a multilateral approach. Clearly, the Philippines is an active claimant in the South China Sea. More than that, we were the one behind arbitration award. More than that, we have an alliance with the US, a status of forces agreement with Australia, and likely one with Japan in the coming years. So we have the backing of superpowers. We're an active claimant state. So we can be very clear, very, very helpful to Malaysia in the South China Sea. Although never expect Malaysia to speak with the same vigor as President Aquino or even President Marcos Jr. when it comes to criticism of China's activities. But nonetheless, I think we're giving them that kind of confidence. If Philippines is there, we normalize criticism of China. And the same way when Duterte was there, it was hard for others to take it tough on China because Philippines, the US treaty ally, was suddenly super friendly to China, right? So we have that norm setting capacity in ASEAN. Because the Philippines, even though we're not the biggest economy or the most active member of ASEAN in many ways, we are the most prominent in one way or another. No, Philippines, everyone wants to know about the Philippines because we have very colorful leaders, right? And we have this very important foreign policy positioning that we have been doing in the coming years. But more than that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they don't want also headache with us, right? They want the issue in Mindanao to be resolved because an unstable Mindanao will inevitably drag in Malaysia, whether on the Sabah issue, on the terrorism issue, whatsoever. So they have a stake in Mindanao moving in the right direction in the same way that they had the stake in us getting bogged down in a Mindanao conflict during the Cold War period. So their priorities have changed. But more than that, as I said, Philippines is a booming economy. We're soon to have bigger economy than Malaysia and Singapore. So I think they're also going to look at opportunities they're going to have with us in economic terms that they never really considered. Because let's be honest, Malaysians, I mean, the sense I got from Malaysia when I used to go a lot as a student to Malaysia before was, Philippines, they don't take us too serious on economic issues, even on geopolitics. But nowadays, I think they're giving us a second look. And who knows, as the Philippines becomes more prominent in the region, we can be taken much more seriously by Malaysia, not only as a source of problem, but also as a source of opportunity. And as I said, Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia right now, is someone who's known for his praises for and how he found a lot of inspiration in the people power revolution in the Philippines. You cannot find any other current, at least, leader in the region who has so much followed Philippine politics and has so much interest in Philippine politics. So that's something plus. I hope we make the most out of it, unless Anwar Ibrahim will be changed again. Because Malaysian, by the way, a lot of people talk about constitutional change, about parliamentaryo tayo, magically everything is going to be fine. Well, look at Malaysian politics now, right? Nakailan na silang prime minister. So I'm not sure he will be around, but let's hope he'll stick around and we can build on this bilateral relationship. Kasi mas stable pa yung politics natin ngayon kaysa Malaysia.
Okay.
What about the Sabah issue? Is that still a critical, ticklish issue for both?
Yeah, alam mo, mahirap talaga, Luciel. I've dealt with officials from the Aquino administration to the Duterte administration, and I'm talking also folks in the current administration. I mean, I think we're really having a hard time dealing with the Sabah issue because look at it. None of our presidents in recent memory really aggressively went on after the issue, right? Because all of them realized in one way or another, really, what is our option here, right? Are we going to push for a referendum by United Nations? Is this really going to work? I mean, my sense is baka pag pinaboto mo yung mga tao sa Sabah, they will vote for their own independence from Malaysia and Philippines. Because they want the oil to themselves. Because for them, they're also not getting their fair share from Kuala Lumpur. But okay, so them not liking Imperial Kuala Lumpur doesn't mean they want to jump to Imperial Manila's rule, right? So that doesn't look like an option. So what? Gera tayo? And we need Malaysia and other issues. So that's talagang magkakamot ng ulo talaga any diplomat. If I were the foreign secretary right now, honestly, I couldn't give you a proper answer. All I could say is, yes, we stand by our claim in the area, but what next? And that's it. We really cannot get a good answer from any policymaker in the Philippines, precisely because it's a deadlock issue. So all we're getting right now are fake news about, blaming Ninoy for everything that went wrong or so on and so forth, right? Maybe Anwar Ibrahim can give us better answers on that because he has read Philippine history pretty well.
Okay, Richard Darren, maraming salamat and happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Richard.
Maraming salamat, guys, and talk to you soon. Hopefully in studio again. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And that's the Thursday edition of the Chiefs. We hope it was discussed. We'll keep the conversation going. Ako po si Robbie Alampay.
I'm Mami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star.
And I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez. We are One News, all sides, all the time.